Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Cal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law.
Welcome back, everyone, to International Law Behind the Headlines. I'm Catherine Amirfar, and this is our series exploring the implications for President-elect Trump's second term and the most important issues of international law and policy. In today's episode, we'll consider the future of the World Trade Organization, also known as the WTO. And I am so grateful and gratified to have Amy Porges as my guest. Among other very, very impressive roles, Amy was formerly the Senior Counsel for Dispute Settlement and Head of Enforcement at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And in that position, which she held during the WTO's first 5 very formative years, she participated in over 100 WTO cases, in addition to leading the U.S. interagency policymaking body on the dispute settlement and representing the U.S. government generally in negotiations. Before that, Amy was a senior legal officer and counselor in the Secretariat of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, the precursor to the WTO, where she helped draft the agreements that formed the WTO package. And most recently, for the past couple of decades, Amy has been in private practice, advising companies, governments, and industry associations on trade law. Amy, welcome. Very happy to have you here today.
Well, it's great to talk with you.
So I want to start, and as you know, we're going to start basic and kind of build up on it for our listeners. So the WTO is the principal forum for settling the rules of international trade. It facilitates trade negotiations among its 164 members, which is up from 123 just in 1994. And in its 2.5 decades, it has helped reduce barriers to trade in both goods and services and created what many view as a distinct dispute resolution system that supporters say have reduced the threat of trade wars. So I want to focus for purposes of my first question on your service in the GATT Secretariat when it encompassed what was known as the Uruguay round negotiations that led to the WTO agreement. So based on that experience, based on being there at inception, could you speak a bit about the goals of the WTO and the balances that were struck at that time to achieve consensus?
Well, okay, so people talk about the WTO as if it had some kind of independent agency, or as if it created the dispute settlement, but this is wrong. Any decisions that the WTO or the GATT took, the GATT which preceded the WTO, these are decisions by the member governments. This really is a member-driven organization. So you can't blame it on the organization, it's the members. And the WTO is definitely the agreement itself and the organization. They're part of the general field of international law. But the motivation that makes it go is really trade relations and trade policy. And quite frankly, in my experience in trade policy, not just, at the GATT Secretariat, before that, I spent 20 years working for USTR as a lawyer in the General Counsel's office, working on trade agreements. And by God, governments have never really been 100% enthusiastic about liberalizing trade. They were willing to lower their tariffs, but only if other governments provided reciprocity in return. So, by the way, the key innovation that created the GATT and the multilateral trade system was when negotiators in the 1940s, figured out a way for a group of countries to negotiate together on tariffs in a round of negotiations and share the benefit of the tariff concessions through the most favored nation clause. So the Uruguay round lasted far longer than anybody originally expected. When it was supposed to end in December 1990, the meeting that was supposed to end it, make the final decisions, collapsed in failure because governments were just not close enough yet. Then negotiations restarted in 1991. They produced a draft final act, which was also not really done. And then there was a legal drafting phase in early 92. The negotiations then marked time waiting for elections. There were a lot of times during the round when there was an election, so everything went on hold till the election was over. So in November 92, there was another final breakthrough when the U.S. and Europe reached the Blair House Agreement on the key issues in agricultural trade. And then there was another interruption, and a final surge in the fall of 93 finished the deal. So you asked about the balances struck to achieve consensus. So it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the key decisions were between the U.S. and Europe. That is the European Economic Community or the European communities. But not absolutely all of them. Other parties, like Canada, the Cairns Group of non-subsidizing agricultural importers, India, Japan, they could have a real impact by working hard on provisions that they really cared about. So, for instance, the Blair House Agreement. This agreement set the framework that became later the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, governing market access, domestic support, that is subsidies for production of agricultural goods, and export subsidies to agriculture. So after the Blair House Agreement came out, it was presented to the other governments in the round as, well, this is the deal, take it or leave it. Mm. But in fact, the final package in December 1993 included negotiated tweaks to the text and a bunch of side deals with third parties. So that's kind of the way it worked. It was a large negotiation, and it was a very tricky job to coordinate it. There were master negotiators involved on the European side, the U.S. side. So, for instance, Warren Laverell on the U.S. side and others. So again, the dispute settlement package was also largely a bilateral deal with, some significant input from others. Among the developing countries, India had a substantial impact on some issues I could name, but most developing countries were not yet focused on exports or on market access. They were mainly trying to hang on to protecting their markets, their own home markets. So, there was a balance. The final package also included goods, services, and intellectual property all together in one package that wouldn't allow any government to cherry pick just the best parts. But, these three areas of goods, services, and intellectual property are structurally separated in the organization and as agreements, and that also was a negotiated part of the balance. And that package also included dispute settlement that was thought at the time could not be frustrated by a losing party. So that's it. I mean, that was the bit. I mean, is this going to be the last major negotiating round ever?
Yeah.
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. And
you now have 163 players in the system. Well, some of them are largely passive and don't have the energy. For instance, a significant number, I don't know how many, probably upwards of 20, maybe upwards of 40, are really small countries that may not even have a delegation in Geneva.
Yeah.
Many smaller countries only have embassies in New York for the UN and in the capital of their former colonial power.
So, Amy, let me stop you there, just because that's a lot, and I want to pull on some of those threads and pick up on some of those threads, because as you've pointed out, it's a long and winding road. Some master negotiators got into almost a complete set, which may have been unthinkable by some when it was first started. And I think it will come as a surprise to many of our listeners that, at least at its origin, in terms of the U.S. perspective, it was rooted in obtaining stronger enforcement for U.S. rights on the international plane. And I want to kind of bring us, with that historical context in mind, bring us up to a bit as we work towards present day. So I want to talk a bit about, and you've talked about some of the remarkable things that the WTO has done in terms of bringing or about these consensus points on trade. I want to talk a little bit about its track record and some of the criticism since its inception for it being effective in certain respects. So to take as an example, in 2022, the Council on Foreign Relations reported that notwithstanding the success, the institution is under considerable pressure, and noted that negotiations on a comprehensive development agenda stalled due to disagreements over, for example, agricultural subsidies and IP rights. Also noted that the COVID-19 pandemic caused a sharp decline in international trade, and as many of us have heard over and over again, has driven uncertainty about the future of global supply chains. So one result of this challenge that I want to talk to you about is this fragmentation, if you will, of multilateralism, and that many countries have turned in this context to bilateral or plurilateral trade agreements. What, in your view, is the current state of play in terms of the effectiveness of the WTO with respect to multilateral trade negotiations? You've already started talking about this. And then I'd like to also have you address that if fragmentation continues, how would this affect global trade patterns in your view? Is there a way back from such fragmentation for the WTO as an institution?
Well, there are many people who badmouth bilateral and free trade agreements, okay? Bilateral or plurilateral. Actually, are you talking about plurilateral agreements generally, or are you talking really about regional trade agreements?
I think mostly regional trade agreements. I think I'm focused mostly, Amy, on some of that energy being pulled out of the multilateral context.
Well, yeah, it complicates things to some extent, but the thing is, there are still things that only the WTO can do. Mm-hmm. For instance, there are what you would call an erga omnes obligation. Or let's say there are certain kinds of things, trade barriers, that can only be efficiently governed by a truly multilateral agreement, specifically domestic support and agricultural export subsidies. So if you're going to try to get governments to reduce their domestic support to agriculture, mm-hmm. It does not work to do that in a free trade agreement. Mm-hmm. No government will decide that it will cut its total support to agriculture just because of one trading partner, because that means that all other trading partners will be able to free ride on that commitment.
Right. And this goes back to what you're saying before in response to the first question, that the name of the game in international trade is reciprocity. And that, I think, as you're saying, is where that is true. It really must put itself in a multilateral context to be effective. Well, let me pivot now, because I want to talk about U.S. relations with the WTO. And that, I think, has been, in some large part, the tail that has wagged that particular dog is China. And it's no secret, and as you know, this is a series that wants to explore implications for President-elect Trump's reelection. And so it's no secret to say that President-elect Trump has favored a policy seen as being hard on China. His 2025 agenda proposes a universal 10% tariff on all imported goods and tariffs as high as 60% on Chinese goods. If this aspect of his trade agenda comes to fruition, what effect would this have on global trade, in your view, and the U.S.'s own ability to remain in free trade agreements?
Well, it is certainly disruptive. Specific. You want to know about disruptive? There are many estimates that have come out about the actual impact this would have on consumers and on consumer prices. The Consumer Technology Association has estimated that this would cause, It would cause the cost of your laptop or tablet to go up by, 46 to 68%. Video game consoles, 40%. Smartphones, 26% minimum. And it's really going to raise prices. And it's odd to think that the president who was elected on the basis of I'm going to get inflation under control would then put these tariffs on that just spark more inflation. especially because these products are largely not made in the United States. It's true that I guess you could make laptops in the United States, perhaps, but it would only, in the short run, happen, I guess, if you could import parts. And where would the parts come from? So, and beyond that, the other tariffs, like the flat tariffs, again, what's happening right now is the olive oil market is going nuts because olive oil importers are thinking, oh my God, 10% tariffs or 20% tariffs. And, there are olive oil producers in the United States, but they don't produce hardly any olive oil, relative to the amount of demand that there is for olive oil. This is fundamentally not a product that is made in the United States. And if you ask the olive oil producers in the United States, I'm not sure that they would be on board with tariffs. I'm pretty sure that, for instance, wine also, Bordeaux wine is not made in the United States. It can't be.
Right.
That's what it means to have, terroir.
Right.
The wine industry has opposed any kind of interference in trade, either in the United States or in Europe or elsewhere, because they don't want to be part of a trade war. During Trump 1.0, governments discovered that counter retaliation, that is, or retaliation for the U.S. tariffs, was a way to get attention.
Yeah,
it definitely did get attention in the United States, but that was quite painful for U.S. exporters. So, for instance, during the China tariffs of 2018, 2019, China basically shifted its purchasing away from the United States. And U.S. farm country has been, I think, has had a lasting impact on their exports. Over the last while, U.S. agriculture, which used to be far more, we used to have a very substantial trade surplus. People were growing much more than Americans could eat, and they were able to export it. But now we actually have a trade surplus in the other way. The U.S. is importing more food than we export. And the trade war of 2018, 2019 is one of the causes. So there are many things going on if you have these tariffs. You have the tariffs, you have economic disruption to U.S. consumers, you have higher prices, often on products that are not made in the United States. If you're having blanket tariffs, you're having also trade retaliation by other governments. And, what you have is trade friction. Now, where is the WTO and all that? The WTO was, let's say, go back to the GATT. Okay, the GATT was established in 1948 in a very imperfect environment. Most world trade in 1948 was governed by quota, quantitative restrictions, rationing. There was post-war reconstruction. There were shortages of food. There were shortages everywhere. And so there was a lot of trade friction. And the GATT was a way to discuss trade problems and to resolve them through negotiation largely. And then gradually it got into the dispute settlement business, which we can talk about later. But but what is the WTO? The WTO succeeds the GATT, and it's still there as an institution where governments can discuss their trade problems with each other without going to outright war.
Well, let's talk about and that obviously, and all of these problems that might be reintroduced by a flat tariff or a high tariff in this respect was the impetus for the WTO in the first place. So as you remind us, the origins of that, again, was rooted in stronger enforcement for U.S. rights internationally. But let me pivot to another angle of the China relationship with the U.S. And that, as you know, last year, China initiated a dispute settlement proceeding against the U.S. and the WTO, contesting what it called the discriminatory subsidies under the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act. And the crux of it was and I'll quote the Chinese mission on this, quote, "Under the disguise of responding to climate change, reducing carbon emission, and protecting the environment, these subsidies are in fact contingent upon the purchase and use of goods from the U.S. or imported from certain particular regions," end quote. So this is this discrimination concept. Tell me a bit about how you think this dispute settlement proceeding will factor into the trade relations between the U.S. and China, and also what it means for the WTO's trade dispute mechanism itself, which, as you know, has been frozen since 2017 in some major respects when the Trump administration blocked appointments and reappointments to the WTO appellate body. And until in December 2019, the body was reduced to so few members it was unable to reach quorum to hear appeals. So that's meant that in the first instance, panel reports, which are appealed by the losing party, are left in limbo without an enforceable final judgment. So if you could bring all those threads together and just tell us where you think the relations with China, how they're impacted by this particular dispute settlement proceeding that's been initiated. And second, what, peering into your crystal ball, do you think it means for trade dispute mechanism under the WTO system more generally?
Let's go back to the beginning. From the beginning of the GATT held rounds of trade negotiations, which resulted in legally binding concessions and enforceable tariff concessions to reduce tariffs. And so these tariff concessions were a store of value created by the institution, by the agreement, and enforceable legally, in theory. So that's the idea. You have something that can be withdrawn. Whereas, how do you enforce an agreement about the ozone layer? Are you going to take away the ozone layer from some government that's violating the treaty? No, you can't. You can't. But you can, in fact, allow one government to suspend the benefits of this store of value, these tariff concessions, against the sinner. So in the Uruguay round, they had, because of an idea by the European community originally, they decided to have an appellate body. So the dispute settlement rules were drafted so that you would have automatic adoption of a panel report, pretty much, unless a government asked for an appeal to the appellate body, and everybody would have a right for an appeal, and the whole thing, the panel report, would go on hold until the appellate body had ruled. They failed to realize that if there were no appellate body, then the panel report would go into limbo, and that's exactly what's happened. The U.S. figured out a way to progressively block. So where does the appellate body come from? The members are nominated one by one, and they have to be approved by consensus. And then the U.S. blocked consensus on every new appellate body member. And as the term limit, as existing appellate body members became term limited, the appellate body sort of dwindled in size and then vanished in 2019, 2020. So that's it, okay? That's your story. And since then, what we have had 25 appeals into the void. Basically, since then, since the appellate body lost its quorum in 2019, the option has been available for every government to appeal into the void. And almost all cases, but not all, have in fact been appealed into the void.
Right.
The interesting thing is that some cases have not been appealed. Governments have accepted them, and they've implemented. It happens. It happens because of other things going on between the countries concerned. Countries actually do sometimes reach agreement to, in fact, solve an ongoing trade grievance, and sometimes the panel report can, in fact, be helpful, especially when there have been elements in the sinner country that were always opposed to what the center country was doing. They just wanted some support. And the WTO report can, in fact, help the elements that oppose some trade barrier to say to the government, come on, let's get rid of this. It's just causing trouble.
So there's a potential for it to actually have some impact.
There is still a potential for things. There are also quite a few settlements that happen during litigation. There are more settlements now during litigation than there used to be, partly because there is not the option of appealing things.
And what do you think the U.S.-China new case will do to this, if anything? What do you think the U.S. reaction would be under the
I don't expect any different reaction by the United States to this case than there was to other cases. The U.S. will, of course, defend. It's what they do.
Yep.
They're not going to roll over and simply say, "Oh, we won't show up." They will show up. That's what they do. That is what USTR does.
So
it defends the United States.
Can I ask you in our remaining 2 minutes? I'm going to ask you a final question for you to peer into your crystal ball again. What do you see as the future of the WTO in the next Trump administration?
It's hard to tell. It's really hard to tell because we don't know at this point. We're looking forward to the. We're looking forward to the Trump inauguration. There have been many announcements by Trump and by people around Trump regarding tariffs. And then there are rumors that the tariff announcements are not serious. There's a lot of uncertainty about what is really going to happen. Will this be a blanket tariff? Will it be a bargaining tariff? Will there be a big announcement that threatens a tariff and then backs away if deals are offered? What's exactly going to happen? How will Trump deal with the Trump administration deal with the massive economic disruption that would be caused by tariffs? Mm-hmm. Will they have an exceptions process, an exclusions process to provide exclusions from these tariffs for instance, where a tariff would lead to closing a factory and putting people out of work?
Yep.
All of these questions have yet to be answered. And these questions, these domestic questions, affect the magnitude of what the Trump administration is going to do and how it will affect other governments. Now, about the WTO, the Trump administration 1.0 did actually participate rather actively in the WTO. They brought some disputes. They did. They participated actively in committees in the WTO. They had a viewpoint. They carried the fight to China rhetorically, but they were there. The Biden administration has not been as visible in the WTO. I don't know what the Trump administration will do. We won't know. We don't even have any appointments below the USTR level.
No, that's right. Really There's a lot of uncertainty.
We don't have a key to what kind of. We even have some hints that the Commerce Department is going to be in charge of USTR. So, which is, I think, hard to believe.
Yeah.
Considering that USTR has definitely statutory roles that are there in statute, the Ways and Means Committee put them there, and it would be very hard to undo those statutes. But back to the point. So you asked me, what's the future? I certainly hope that the Trump administration will not withdraw, that it will understand that nothing is to be gained by withdrawing in the WTO. China is able to claim that the U.S. is violating the WTO and that China is totally innocent. This may or may not be true. I know the Trump administration believes it is not true. And if it believes this is not true, they should be there in the WTO and they should say so. Because if they don't stay in the WTO, they are surrendering the field.
Understood. Amy, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. A lot to think about, and certainly take note of the uncertainty, and a lot to be developed in the coming weeks and months. So thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you. Thank you again.